Hello, and thank you, David, for inviting me to talk to you about child bereavement. I am Mary Claire Kelly. I normally do this face to face, but like many of us, I've been on a steep technological learning curve, and so I thought I would record it and you can watch it at a time that suits you when you're not being interrupted by young people or family members in this new world that we're finding ourselves in. So just a little bit about me. I am a school counsellor. I work in a school that I see children from age 7 to 18. I also work in private practice. My background was in bereavement. I did 5 years of voluntary work for Cruise Bereavement Care, seeing adults in the community, and I also worked as training facilitator for Jigsaw South East, which is a charity dedicated to helping young people with bereavement. And so that's a little bit about me. But today I want to give you a little bit of knowledge. Normally the presentation would be an hour and a half, so there's lots and lots to say. So I've tried to cherry pick the bits that will hopefully help you to feel a little bit more equipped to support children who have been bereaved, because of course, unfortunately, we're coming into a time where we're probably all going to be involved in that quite a lot. So what we're going to cover today, or what I'm going to endeavour to cover in half an hour, is what children understand at different developmental stages, and to take a moment to think about what death means to a child, what the thoughts and the cognitions that might be around that for a young person. I'm going to just go through some of the signs of grief, some of the things that we perhaps need to be on the lookout for with our students, our pupils, and then what is helpful and unhelpful when we're talking with bereaved children. And finally, I'll point you in the direction of some resources and support. There is a PowerPoint presentation with this, which I will be sending to David, but I'm just going to talk without showing you the slides, so I haven't managed that bit yet. But just briefly to touch on very young children, I know obviously you're probably more interested in school age children, but there is this myth that very young children don't feel the impact of a bereavement, and of course this isn't true, because what we know about attachment is in those very early months for child's development, they are completely dependent on care from a key attachment figure, usually a parent, mother or father, and that this relationship is what actually triggers development in the brain. Of course, if they were to lose that relationship because of death or illness of a parent, then that will have a detrimental effect. And so what you see in very young children is a tetchiness, an inability to settle, sometimes an inability to feed effectively, because the child's equilibrium has really been disrupted by the absence of that person. But hopefully another person will quickly make a good bond with them and limit the damage there. But you may think that it's only if a parent has been lost, but in fact if a parent is bereaved, and of course unfortunately we're going to see a lot of that, then if you think about it, when you pick up a baby, when you're feeding a baby, when you're changing a baby, there's lots of eye contact, there's a lot of usually verbal interaction, copying of sounds and facial expressions and so forth. But if the parent is depressed, then of course their mind is going to be on other things, and they're not going to be focused in the same way on the child, and the child isn't going to get that same interaction. And again, you may see, I don't know if any of you have seen the still face experiment, but a baby who isn't being responded to becomes very distressed very quickly and will exhibit all sorts of behaviours to try and get that attention back, that focus back, because they need it for brain development. So again, tetchiness and being unable to settle. So, and that's in really young children. But as they get a little bit older, so 6 months to 2 years, this is the point at which they're able to create an internal image of the person and therefore become aware that something is missing. And so sometimes we see some quite strange, what we might think of as strange behaviour, but of course it makes sense when you understand. They're responding to that feeling that something is missing, so they may go searching. They may be looking out of the window, they may be looking under beds or in cupboards for the person that's missing. They may not be able to verbalise what it is that they're doing, but it can be quite distressing if you don't understand that. Children, sort of preschool, still preschool, but 2 to 5 years, you know, they don't have that understanding of the permanence of the state of death. So they may ask questions like, when are we going to see Grandad again? Or when are we going to see whoever again? And they may not react to the news. And sometimes this worries parents and adults, because we think, oh, have they really understood it? Have they really got it? But it may just be that they're just not computing that this is a permanent thing, and that's okay. But the one thing that we do have to watch out for, starting at this age but actually going all the way through the stages of development, and it's really important, is this tendency towards magical thinking. And that is, you know, as a small child you feel, you sort of believe that your worldview is egocentric, so everything that you do seems to have an effect on the world, and everything in the world seems to somehow be related to you. And at this point, children often feel responsible. So when somebody's died, they may interpret it as being a result of something that they've done. So have they been naughty? Did they do what they were supposed to do? Have they brought this on themselves in some way? And that can be really upsetting, but they may never verbalise that. So in fact, what's very, very important is that we keep repeating, this is nobody's fault. This is not your fault. You didn't cause this to happen. It's just one of those things that happens, and it's horrible, but this is what happens. It's not your fault. So coming on a little bit older now and going into school age, you know, from about the age of 5 or 6, they're beginning to understand this idea of permanence, that somebody isn't coming back. The other thing that comes with that, unfortunately, is that it's also the inevitability of death. So they begin to understand that people die, they don't come back, and that not only do people die, but everyone dies. And this, if you think of a young child, is absolutely terrifying, because they realise suddenly that every person that they know and love, every person they depend on, including themselves, at some point is going to die. And so helping a child to accommodate this understanding can be difficult, and sometimes it really jumps up and hits them when there's a loss close in the family. So enabling them to talk about that fear is really important. They'll ask lots of questions. This is that really inquisitive age, isn't it, where they're desperate to learn, and so they're going to ask lots of questions, and sometimes those questions can make you feel uncomfortable, but we need to be direct and we need to be honest. The other thing that we might see is separation anxiety, and if we were at school in the normal way, we might see children finding it difficult to leave their parents in the morning and come to school, and that's understandable. If something's happened to somebody close to you, you're jolly well not going to let those essential people out of your sight, because you don't want anything to happen to them. We also need to be aware that they will be very sensitive at this age to how adults behave around bereavement and loss. So if we all clam up when they come in the room, they're going to get that message that they can't talk about it. So actually some discussion, some openness about how we feel is really important, because it sort of gives them permission, doesn't it? And helps them not to feel worried by how they're feeling. So sometimes we need to give them permission to grieve. And it's very important that we think about the language that we use. So one thing that people often say is, oh, you're so brave, you've been so brave. And actually that's not helpful, because what we're doing is we're giving them this message that it's not okay to be upset, it's not okay to feel devastated. And actually you don't then stop the child feeling like that. But what you do is you get them to hide it, and then they feel guilty about feeling it because they know it's not acceptable. So words like, oh, you've been so brave, or so-and-so would be so proud of you because you're not crying, not helpful at all. So moving on now to that older age group, 9 to 13, you know, older childhood, they are becoming more aware of the long-term implications, and sometimes they're also aware of financial and practical implications, and so a lot of worries might come out, and not knowing quite if we can ask about, you know, what's going to happen about money or the house and all of these things. School refusal at this stage, at that age, becomes more common. Of course, at the moment, everyone's at home anyway. And mood swings. And of course, this is the beginning of puberty often, and so we're beginning to see these hormonal changes anyway. So the mood swings can be very extreme. And the thing about this age is they really don't want to feel different from their peers. So actually sharing and talking about bereavement with their friends is something they might avoid, because they don't want to seem like the miserable one or the unhappy one, or, you know, and they want to fit in. And, you know, interestingly, at this age, things that can be concerning for them are things like, you know, oh, we're not going to have any money, so I'm not going to have the right things. And that may seem really shallow, but at this age, it's so important. Those peer relationships are so important, and it's all about where do I fit in the world, and being accepted and connected with people. So it's really hard. And unfortunately, we do see bullying around bereavement at this age, and that's something that we really have to look out for. Excuse me. Oh. And something else at this age is that you may suddenly see that a child becomes terrifically grown up. They suddenly take on this mantle, and we have to be careful that somebody hasn't said, well, you know, you're the man of the family now, or, you know, it's your responsibility to look after the family now. And the child internalises this new role in response to the loss. But what can happen quite naturally is they suddenly can become really grown up and mature, or the other way, they can suddenly regress and become really childish. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on. And then moving into teenage and young adulthood, you know, this is, at this stage, children are, young people are far more aware of the full ramifications in a similar way to how an adult would be. They may experience their emotions very intensely. They probably will. And they also may bottle up feelings, again, for reasons I spoke about earlier, about wanting to fit in with the group, not wanting to be seen as being you know, bringing the mood down or whatever. Their role in their social circle is very important to them, and unfortunately it often leads to risk-taking behaviours such as drinking alcohol and taking drugs and so forth. So this is they're really vulnerable at this age, and so it's very important that we're aware that this is a stage at which, you know, we need to make sure that although it's sometimes harder to connect with young people at this age, that they do get the access to the support that they need. And before I move on to, I'm going to talk about symptoms, things to look out for, I just wanted to spend a few moments about thinking about death from a child's point of view. Going back a few years, when we lived in a far more religious society, conversations about what happened when you die were far more commonplace than they are now. Now it's something we don't really talk about, and consequently the only sort of ideas that young people have about death very often are this sort of fantasy horror ideas. So ghosts, zombie stories, horror stories, all of these things can be there in the mix. And just to give you an example, I remember working with a child whose grandmother had said he'd lost his dad. His grandmother had said how comforting she found it, that she felt that his dad was around her. But for this boy, he couldn't sleep for weeks because he was terrified that he was going to see his dad and that his dad would be some kind of ghost or zombie or undead, and it absolutely terrified him. So the comfort that grandmother had taken from it because of her view of an afterlife really wasn't available to him because he didn't have those terms of reference. So it's something to be aware of. Often if children have had pets, then they may well have been through this process of thinking about, well, what happens when you die, and what is the relationship between body and spirit, or whatever, however they might talk about it. And if they come from a faith family, then they may actually have some very clear views, and it's important that we don't put our ideas onto children, but that we help them to explore their own thinking and perhaps the thinking of the faith in which they have been raised. But it's important that we think about it just for a moment from their point of view, because what is death? If it isn't Halloween and zombies, maybe it's in a video game, what happens when you die? You come back to life. So the reality of death and the thoughts that they have about it may be quite different from our own. So I want to move on to talking about some of the symptoms, what to look out for, because these are the sort of things we may see. It's going to be difficult when we're not together physically, but at least if we know what might happen, then we can ask perhaps the right questions when we are talking to young people. So first of all, we're going to expect, I suppose, to see some emotional response, and this might come out in terms of what we might think of as bad behaviour, so tantrums and mood swings, overreacting to events. And this is because the child's capacity to manage their emotions is really challenged when something like this happens. But also it may go the other way, and you suddenly have somebody who's trying really, really hard to please. So, suddenly doing all their homework, or just being the perfect child, and they never have been really. And so this might be a sign of magical thinking, and so it's important that we try to get under the surface and unpick that. And really, it's anything that is a significant change that we're looking out for. And sometimes I have parents ring and say, so-and-so hasn't cried since their granddad died. He just comes in and goes straight up to his room and plays video games, and he's not talked about it, and he's not been crying, and I'm really worried about him. I think he needs to talk to somebody. And I will sort of say, well, is this unusual for them? No. So even when there isn't anything wrong, they just come straight in, go upstairs and play their video games. Yes. Well, then they're probably okay. What you're looking for is a huge change. If this is a person who never talked about how they felt or cried, then they're not going to suddenly change. So it's those big changes in behaviour that we're looking out for. Also changes in appetite, that might mean loss of appetite. It could mean overeating. And this might be a result of a lack of routine, because practical things have changed. If the person who always cooked the dinner isn't there to cook the dinner, then perhaps just don't feel hungry. And you may, if it gets extreme, then obviously we've got to keep an eye and maybe get health professionals involved. But usually those changes are temporary. Watching out for sleep patterns as well. You may notice a drop in educational achievement, and this might be a sign of lack of sleep. And it's usual to have some sleep disturbance. Grief is exhausting, and we're not always aware of how much energy it takes just to get through the day when you're grieving. The other thing is that a child might be hypervigilant because they're really frightened that somebody's going to die. And so they may not be able to relax. And unfortunately, this has not been helped by people talking. People don't do it so much now, but they used to say, you know, well, Granny just fell asleep. And, you know, if for a young child to be told, well, Granny fell asleep and she's never coming back, are you ever going to let any of your parents sleep ever again? Maybe not. So we have to keep an eye on it though, because long-term sleep disturbance can be linked to clinical depression. So it's something that we really need to be aware of, and maybe it's just a matter of asking questions, discussing perhaps with parents, discussing with the child how they are, their general well-being. But talking about schoolwork being affected, and I mentioned regression earlier, I mean, children sometimes will, and it shows in education quicker often than in other ways, but you know, one of the early signs of a child struggling is that their reading or their writing ages will drop, and this is a psychological defence. A child will go back, regress to a stage in which a developmental stage in which they felt more secure, sort of until the personality can build itself back up, and so it's usually temporary, doesn't last very long. You might see behaviours such as very childish baby talk, return of stammers or speech impediments, or sucking the thumb, or needing the teddy bear, or sometimes it's bedwetting or soiling. So, but this is usually a temporary thing. It's unusual, thankfully, but it's a temporary thing, but it can happen. And the other thing is illness. So children often complain of headaches or tummy aches. And very young children, they don't really, you know, they experience anxiety, they experience stress in the body. So it's not that they're attention seeking, but they are genuinely suffering with a headache or feeling sick or so forth. But it is their experience of anxiety. They may also get very worried about other people's health. I mean, you know, this awful virus, and we're told that some people will have very mild symptoms. So anyone even just coughing or clearing their throat is enough to trigger that anxious thought, are they going to die? So they may get very worried about their own health. I mean, we're all doing that. We're all waking up in the morning, aren't we, and thinking, am I all right? Have I got a temperature? And, but they may become quite transfixed on the symptoms. You know, at the moment, obviously I'm talking about coronavirus, but in other conditions, you know, if somebody died of a brain cancer, for example, then a headache might have a really big meaning to a child and carry a lot of fear. It's important that you're aware of your own expectations. I'm aware that I'm running out of time here, but to be aware of your own expectations, that different children will respond in different ways. So I've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to very briefly touch on things that are helpful and unhelpful. You know, when we're talking with children, I think it's important that we acknowledge our own fears and our own worries. We worry that perhaps we're going to open the floodgates and not be able to close them again. We worry that, and it's important when you're having a conversation with a young person to put in some boundaries and say, you know, we've only got a short time to talk today, or I've got 10 minutes to talk to you, or whatever, so that they're aware of that. You're worried that you might make it worse. You know, you can't make it worse. The worst has already happened. All you are doing, I suppose, is being a hand to hold in the darkness of this loss, and being a listening ear, and that's really important, so that the child isn't experiencing it or doesn't feel alone and isolated in their experience. And we often worry that we don't know what to say. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. What's helpful? Well, it's really helpful to name and acknowledge the emotions. I will often say to children when they've just lost someone, you know, you're going to feel all sorts of things. You're going to feel sad at times, obviously, but you may also feel, sometimes you may feel happy, and that's okay. You know, you mustn't feel guilty for being happy, because it's all right. Some days you may not feel sad. And you may feel angry. You know, a lot of people feel very angry afterwards, but you're likely to feel a whole mixture of emotions, and whatever you feel is okay. This is to be expected. So normalising emotion for them is important. Often children, you know, it's hard for them to understand, and they may need the story, they may need to be told things again, and that first stage of grief is shock and not being able to accept it. So needing to talk or tell you the same thing 2 or 3 times. And actually it's helpful if you don't say, I know, you've already told me, but if you can actually just let them tell it again, because what they're doing is they're processing what they've understood. And of course, asking open questions, the sort of qualitative questions such as, so, you know, how are you feeling today, as opposed to, are you okay, which could have a yes or no answer. Things that are really unhelpful are trying to cheer children up, because actually, you know, if they're coming to you, if they're talking to you about how sad they're feeling, trying to cheer them up is very much giving them the message that they're either wrong to feel that sad, or that it's not appropriate for them to share their sad feelings with you. And of course you won't really cheer them up, because you can't change what's happened. And there is a time when it's appropriate to distract children and to move them on, of course. But constant distraction is again saying, put this feeling away, it's not okay to feel like this. Equally, we shouldn't be pressurising children to talk. You know, a lot of children, they don't want to talk about it. All they need to know is that if they did, that you were there, or that you are holding them in mind and that you're aware of what's happened, so that they feel that somebody is understanding what's happened to them. I mentioned about saying, you know, going to sleep, or we've lost granddad, or whatever. You know, euphemisms aren't terribly helpful, particularly for children who perhaps have language difficulties or learning difficulties, or autism, where they need to have very clear explanations of things. So euphemisms aren't very helpful, but similarly using judgmental language, as I mentioned before, about, you know, saying you're big and brave, or so-and-so would be so proud of you. You know, we don't need to load emotional guilt onto young people. Another thing that we may notice in ourselves is that we might have an expectation of how long somebody's going to be affected by a death, or how, depending on how close that person was, how much that death would affect them. But, you know, people are brought up by all sorts of different members of the family now. So to say somebody was an aunt or a cousin, it may belie the fact that actually that person was like a mother or father to them. So we need to not make assumptions about how they're going to experience this loss, or impose our own time scales. You know, well, it's been 2 months now, they really should be okay, because grief comes and goes in waves, and they re-experience it at different times as they get older. And another thing that we tend to do because of our empathetic nature is to say, yes, I lost a friend, or yes, that similar thing happened to me. And actually that's not helpful with young people, because although what we're trying to do is to make them feel understood, we can do that by empathetic listening. But if we say we've also lost someone, what they may then do, if they're particularly a caretaking type personality, it is then feel that they can't talk about their loss, because they might trigger your sadness. So I pretty much whizzed through there's a lot to talk about, and a lot more that I could say which might be helpful, but I hope that sometime I'll be able to come and meet you properly. But I hope this has been useful. In the PowerPoint there are some sources of support at the end, and for yourselves, because this is likely to be difficult, you know, using support of your colleagues and each other, but also the Education Support Partnership is a really good resource if you need to talk to somebody, if you need to talk things through, and it's open to all people that work in education. So I would like to thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you to Roland Brothers for enabling this to happen. And I really hope that I will be able to come and meet you at some stage, and good luck with all the support that you're giving our young people at the moment. Thank you.